A treasure hunter with a reputation for crude behavior, no formal education, and modest roots, William Phips was a surprise pick for governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay. Even stranger considering that the man who chose him was New England's most highly regarded minister, Increase Mather. Welcome to The Thing About the Salem Witch Trials. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. On January 20th, 1687, divers made a discovery that started William Phips on his path to that governorship.
That day, Captain Francis Rogers sent a boat and a canoe from the sloop Henry to search for a shipwreck in the Atlantic Ocean, southeast of Turks and Caicos and north of the island of Hispaniola in what is now the Dominican Republic. The area was then called Ambrosia Bank, but is now Silver Bank.
The boat and canoe maneuvered through a series of coral formations that had made it treacherous to get the ship in position. Within 2 hours, the crew of the canoe spotted something beneath the surface, a large formation of coral with cannons sticking out. The wood of the ship had largely rotted, but the guns were clearly visible.
Over the next 2 days, divers recovered 8 bars of gold and about 3,000 coins. They had found a 45-year-old Spanish shipwreck named the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. On January 23rd, the Henry sailed for Puerto Plata, Hispaniola, where William Phips and his crew waited.
For this expedition, investors supplied Phips with the 200-ton ship James and Mary, which was about 4 times the size of the Henry, and would be needed to haul the massive take back to England. This was the beginning of a treasure recovery operation that gathered gold and silver worth more than 200,000 pounds at the time, an astronomical sum.
According to the Bank of England inflation calendar, that amount in 1687 had the buying power of about 38 million pounds today, the equivalent of over 50 million US dollars.
And Phips didn't take all the treasure. He was concerned the location of the shipwreck would be discovered soon, and that would put his crew and ship in danger, so he decided to take what he could and left on April 19th.
But who was this William Phips? Let's backtrack a moment and learn about his beginnings. William was born February 2nd, 1651 in what is now Woolwich, Maine. His father, James Phips, had migrated to Maine around 1630 as an indentured apprentice of John Brown, a blacksmith and gunsmith from Bristol, England.
William did not follow in his father's footsteps. According to Cotton Mather's biography of Phips, when he was 18, he was apprenticed for 4 years to a shipbuilder, possibly from the Clark and Lake Company. The daughter of Thomas Lake of Clark and Lake married into the Mather family. First, she married Reverend John Cotton, and then Reverend Increase Mather, whose first wife had been John Cotton's aunt.
They're all marrying into each other. And this relationship between Lake, the Mathers, and the Cottons may have been how William Phips was introduced to Increase and Cotton Mather, and the Mathers would advocate for Phips and secure his position as governor.
Trace any major thread of colonial New England history, and the Mathers were likely there. Did you know that Jonathan Edwards, the defining preacher of the Great Awakening, had a grandmother who once carried the Mather name? When Increase Mather's brother Eleazar died, his widow, Esther Warham, remarried Minister Solomon Stoddard, the grandfather of Jonathan Edwards, so making Jonathan her grandson.
But here's where it gets interesting. Esther's father was John Warham, the minister of Windsor, Connecticut, the town that accused Alice Young, the first person executed for witchcraft in colonial America. 2 of Warham's own children died in the Windsor epidemic of 1647, the same year Young was hanged.
Jonathan Edwards, the great-grandson of Windsor's own minister and grandson of a woman who once bore the Mather name, became the man who shaped American revivalism.
Back to Phips. William Phips didn't learn to read until the age of 21, and he would never master writing. Actually, Puritans encouraged the reading of the Bible from a very early age, and every town was required to have a school. After his shipbuilding apprenticeship ended in 1673, William moved to Boston to work as a shipwright.
That same year, he married Mary Spencer Hull, the widow of a merchant named John Hull, who is not to be confused with the wealthier John Hull, who had been the master of the colony's mint. Mary may have known her husbands from Maine.
Yeah, her first two husbands, and then she went on to marry a third time after Phips's untimely death. She married the court of Oyer and Terminer magistrate Peter Sargent.
Back to Phips. William continued to work as a shipbuilder and ship's captain. Shortly after his marriage to Mary, he began to build a 117-ton ship at the shipyard at Jermisquam Neck, now part of Woolwich, Maine.
On August 14th, 1676, William had to flee King Philip's War because there was an attack on that area. He sailed to Boston with his family and neighbors. They hustled and got out of there, and the ship had just been finished it when they had to hightail it out of Woolwich.
Then, in the 1680s, English patrons financed Phips' expeditions hunting for shipwrecks loaded with Spanish treasure, royal treasure hunting.
For an attempt in 1683, he borrowed a prize ship from King Charles II in exchange for delivering an order to cancel the Massachusetts Bay Charter back to Boston, along with royal agent Edward Randolph.
So he was involved in the charter both times.
He's involved in taking it away and involved in replacing it with the new one.
The January 20th, 1687 expedition we opened this episode with led to wealth, fame, and knighthood.
In all, they recovered over 68,000 pounds of silver and 25 pounds of gold, which those metals would be worth over 77 million with today's values of the precious metals.
Phips got a cut of 11,000 pounds. He was born to an indentured tradesman on the Maine frontier, and he's now the wealthiest man in New England.
And Mary Phips received a golden cup worth in itself 1,000 pounds. And William was knighted by the king.
William Phips was the first American-born recipient of the title Sir. The king who granted it, James II, was the last Catholic monarch to rule England.
Home from treasure hunting, Phips joined Boston's North Church, where the Mathers preached.
He was baptized in early 1690. I can't help but point out that he was knighted before he was baptized. And he was admitted as a member of the church after relating his conversion experience to the congregation on March 23rd, 1690.
And I want to point out that contemporaries in England also had that concern about him, that he was made a general in the same year that he was baptized. So they thought he was too fresh and inexperienced to be made a general and be baptized the same exact year. Also in 1690, William Phips tried his hand as a military leader. In May 1690, following a French and Wabanaki attack that killed 30 colonists at Salmon Falls, Maine, Phips led and helped finance an expedition against French-held Port Royal, Acadia.
While his raid was successful up there, Fort Loyal fell in Falmouth, Maine on May 21st. Some pointed out that the loss of Fort Loyal was more significant than the capture of Port Royal. But Phips and other New Englanders saw this as an opportunity for a large-scale assault on Canada to capture it once and for all and end the back-and-forth tug-of-war over land.
Preparations began for a two-pronged attack. Massachusetts forces under Sir William Phips would make an amphibious assault on Quebec, while a force from New York and Connecticut would attack Montreal by land, splitting the French forces. But during these preparations, Phips and his men met with some resistance from the colonists.
One, Captain John Alden, the son of Mayflower passengers and future accused witch of the Salem witch trials, attempted to commandeer a gun from Marblehead. Residents rioted, forcing him to withdraw. Then there was trouble in Middlesex County, too, where Major Thomas Henchman was unable to enlist enough men to meet the county's quota. The governor's council ordered him to levy troops from the town. In the end, he went to Quebec at the head of a force of 308 men.
And by the beginning of August, New England had managed to assemble a fleet of 34 ships and an army of some 2,300 men. Though Phips had held out hope of receiving supplies from England, his patience wore thin, and the season for a battle would soon be ending.
The fleet embarked on August 10th. Due to bad weather, it took 2 months to sail from Boston to Quebec, canceling any benefit of surprise the English may have had. What's worse, at the same time, the companion move from New York never happened.
Yeah, smallpox raged through the ranks, and disagreements divided the leaders from Connecticut and New York. Without the English attack on Montreal, the French were able to keep all of their forces in Quebec instead of having them divided between the two cities.
So when Phips arrived off of Quebec, he found the city defended by more troops than he had at his disposal. The French had some 2,700 men on hand. After a fruitless naval bombardment of the city and some minor skirmishes, the Phips fleet returned home.
In all, 4 New England ships were lost, and nearly 400 Englishmen died, and an untold number were wounded. During the trip back to Boston, food stores ran low, and a smallpox epidemic spread across the fleet. Then, when the soldiers got home, they carried the smallpox all around the colony back to their communities.
The financial losses were extraordinary, as that expedition cost roughly 50,000 pounds at the time, equivalent to more than 14 million in today's dollars, which is a bargain compared to modern military spending, but was a huge sum for a colony in 1690.
Yeah, to cover the debt, the Massachusetts Bay Colony increased taxes, but they could not break even with that. And they had to print currency for the first time in December 1690, which caused an inflation crisis.
William Phips became the center of controversy around the failed military expedition and the substantial financial loss. With trouble all around him, Phips sailed for England in January 1691.
He arrived in London on March 4th, 1691, and remained there until March 7th, 1692, working with New England's leading Puritan minister, Reverend Increase Mather, to secure a new colonial charter for Massachusetts Bay. The old charter of 1629 had been revoked in 1684. As we mentioned earlier, Phips was involved in going to retrieve that document. And Massachusetts was ruled in the interim first by the Dominion of New England, which was sort of a super colony that had one royal governor who was in charge of everything from basically Canada over to New Jersey, including New York. So it was New England and New York and New Jersey and parts of Canada that were all in one big government. The people of Massachusetts generally hated it. When King William and Queen Mary took charge in England, the people in Massachusetts rebelled against the royal governor, threw him out of office, and set up their own interim government, which had been in charge for a few years by now.
The leaders of Massachusetts wanted to either see the old charter restored or a new charter created. Increase Mather favored a new charter.
While in London, Phips also answered charges related to the failed military expedition to Canada and to his conduct after capturing Port Royal from the French, specifically his treatment of the French governor of Port Royal was unbecoming of an officer. But he managed to deflect most of the criticism and even attempted to persuade the Lords of Trade to give him command of a new attack on Canada. He was not successful on that account.
Deliberations over the charter and the new governor continued for months. Mather supported Phips for governor, as did the important English noblemen Sir Henry Ashurst and Daniel Finch, the second Earl of Nottingham, 2 men who would receive correspondence from Phips during the Salem witch trials. Sir Henry was one of the agents for the Massachusetts Bay Colony in England. Without representation in Parliament, the American colonies had to hire well-placed lobbyists.
And Nottingham was a bigger deal than Ashurst. In the 1690s, Nottingham was the Secretary of State of the United Kingdom, and he had previous experience as the head of the entire Navy.
The charter was signed in October of 1691. By December 3rd, Phips had been appointed governor as well as commander-in-chief of all New England militias. William Stoughton was selected deputy governor, Isaac Addington would be secretary, and there would be 30 counselors.
On January 3rd, 1692, Mather and Phips finished their business at the king's residence, the Palace of Whitehall, and kissed the king's hand in a gesture of gratitude.
The two men left London on March 7th, 1692, sailed from Dartmouth, England on the frigate Nonsuch on March 29th, and landed in Boston with the charter on May 14th, 1692. I can't help but think what had just started right before March 7th with the Salem witch trials, and then on May 14th, all that had transpired.
Yeah, and then by this point, there are dozens of people in jail for witchcraft already, and things are just heating up and exponential growth in the accusations. They're just popping, so many at once. And on May 16th, 1692, the new charter and commissions were officially read at the Boston Town House, and Phips was proclaimed governor of Massachusetts.
In one of surprisingly few decisions Phips made regarding the witchcraft on May 27, 1692, Phips created the Court of Oyer and Terminer that would try the witchcraft cases and others that had not been tried during the interim government. Phips appointed 9 judges to the court, including Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, who became the Chief Justice.
In June, Phips requested advice from local ministers on how to proceed with the witch trials. The return of several ministers was submitted June 15th. In it, ministers urged caution on spectral evidence. However, they closed with a note encouraging, quote, the speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious according to the direction given in the laws of God and the wholesome statutes of the English nation for the detection of witchcrafts.
On June 25th, William Phips ordered the arrest of Baptist minister William Milbourne for daring to submit petitions questioning the judgment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, like the evidences they were accepting.
Yeah, the spectral evidence and other things they were doing that. But you didn't question the government at this point in time, or they would arrest you and throw you in jail and assess large fines. So, anyways. In July, Phips momentarily granted Rebecca Nurse a reprieve, but was soon dissuaded by some Salem gentlemen.
Early in August, there's been 6 hangings by now, Phips and his military force traveled to Maine for the construction of Fort William Henry at Pemaquid. Then on September 17th, sailed to Pemaquid again. Other than his 2 trips in August and September, he had been in Boston during the entire Salem witch trials.
But he would lie about that and make it seem to the English that he had been in Maine on the frontier working for them to protect their territory from the French. So he made it seem like he'd been out of town and very busy and couldn't have bothered with the witch trials because he had this military thing on his hands, and that's national security. That's so important. By September 20th, Phips had approved a writing project by Cotton Mather to document the witch trials, which resulted in the book The Wonders of the Invisible World being published in October. This book was Cotton's defense of the justices and the methods they employed to root out witches.
Phips had not written to England about the witch panic until October 12th, 1692. He had to wait for the response on the witchcraft trials from the monarchs, so he suspended the Court of Oyer and Terminer until he knew what their wishes were.
Phips may have enclosed a copy of Cotton Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World for London to read.
And I want to point out that version only names like 5 of the accused witches. It leaves out Rebecca Nurse and others.
Definitely. He only selected 5 sample cases to illustrate what had happened in the cases more generally. But he picked basically the 5 guiltiest looking people. So that was his thing. Martha Carrier, George Burroughs, those kinds of big name people who were defiant against their charges.
All other accounts of the witch trials were banned from being published.
And then, in another twist, Lady Mary Spencer Phips herself was named as a witch. She was not formally charged, but her name was out there as being a witch, which could lead eventually to formal charges.
On October 29th, the court of Oyer and Terminer was officially shut down. It was closed.
And then a month later, William Phips appointed judges of the Superior Court of Judicature, which took over the witchcraft cases as well as other felonies. In January 1693, Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, who had been the Chief Justice of the Court of Oyer and Terminer and was now also the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Judicature, he signed a death warrant for some 8 people who had not been executed yet, including 5 who were convicted in September, and then 3 more that were convicted in January were also supposed to be executed, and they were going to be hanged on February 1st. But January 31st, the day before, the governor swoops in with a reprieve, and so they're safe. They're not going to be hanged. He overrules William Stoughton's execution warrant, which angers William Stoughton. He stormed off the court temporarily, but he came back. And then on February 21st, 1693, Phips wrote his second letter to England of the whole witchcraft crisis. He wrote to the Earl of Nottingham, detailing his excuses for why the witch panic had happened on his watch. Primarily, he blamed his lieutenant governor, who was leading the court, and this is where he was making it seem like Phips himself had been away prosecuting a war, and his lieutenant governor had been back home messing everything up. And then Phips was recalled to England in 1694 to answer a number of complaints. But while he was there, he died on February 18th, 1695, after a few days of malignant fever. He died at the age of 44. For even more on the Salem witch trials, listen to Salem Witch Trials Daily. That's our daily podcast where we talk about the events that happen as they happen in the Salem witch trials. So check that out.